Call today and join the people's movement to bring their story to life. Thank you.
Underwriting for This Is America is made possible by the American Legacy Foundation. Tobacco-related illnesses kill about 165,000 women each year. You should know. AmericanLegacy.org. The National Education Association, the nation's largest advocate for children and public education. The American Federation of Teachers, more than 1 million professionals working to inspire the lives of students, parents, and communities nationwide. The Korean Information Service, Korean Air, the Korea National Tourism Organization, Tata Consultancy Services, the Good Life TV Network, Tiber Potomac Consulting, the CTC Foundation, and the National Italian-American Foundation.
You know these things. You know these things. Excuse me. Hi, folks. I'm Dennis Foley. This is America. Thanks so much for joining us. Each week, as you know, we invite 6 interesting and influential people to come together around the dinner table. The more diverse the group, the better. Always to talk about the week's top news stories and the deeper issues that face this great country of ours. I'm fascinated with how people get through tragedy, whether it's on a large scale like we all have had to deal with the events, the tragic events of September 11th, or a personal tragedy. It could be a close friend of mine just died, and people have severe illness or divorce or whatever. But anyway, we have assembled, that's the general theme of the program. We've got a wonderful group of people with us. So let me go around the table and just ask each of you on a personal level, and we're all old enough, I'm sure, that we've all experienced something negative in our lives, some big event. How did you get through it? What was the event, if you can talk about that, and how did you get through it?
Well, when my husband died many years ago, we were very, very close, and I regard myself as both religious and spiritual. I turned to God.
Mm-hmm. Father Byron?
I found, actually it goes back to the late 60s, the Vietnam protests and all of that, and when the various voices were rising, the prophetic voices, and you say, well, who's right, who's wrong, and they're calling kids to immolate themselves and all of that. I went into Galatians chapter 5, and I saw the criteria there. Paul calls them the fruit of the Spirit for the authentic prophet and the authentic direction for me. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And I say, is that what he is saying? Is that really the prophetic voice? Or is this some self-aggrandizing exercise? Then you began to hear the prophets like Martin Luther King, and you began to hear people like Cesar Chavez, and you said, that's authentic. And that gave me direction in moving through really very, very troubled decade when everything was under assault and people were looking to their personal values, lining them up. Where are you going? Into the future. Mm-hmm. But if you internalize those principles, you can put one foot in front of the other and feel that you're, in my case, following Christ.
Jim?
Well, maybe a very secular response. Mm-hmm. My mom had a way of focusing us on constants and on distinguishing between what was constant and what was in flux. And I remember when I was a little kid, I'd get haircuts I didn't like, and I wanted to wear a hat. Not everybody seeing me. And Mom said she had a little proverb in Arabic she'd used that translated loosely to, would it be noticed by somebody riding by on a horse? When my dad died, I didn't cry for 2 days. She was very distraught. my parents were much older than I. How could we go on, whatever? But I stayed strong until about 3 days into it when I just lost it. And she came in to see me. I was sitting on the bed in Mom and Dad's room. And she said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "How can we go on? How are we ever going to go on?" And she said to me, "Would it be noticed by somebody riding by on a horse?" And what I understood was that there are these ups and there are these downs and there are these periods where enormous change seems to pull the rug out from under you. But if you stay strong and you keep focused, the long term, you'll look back and say to yourself, it was just a moment, and it passed, and we went on from it. And of course she was right. I mean, years later, I remember the story, I remember the pain, but what I remember more than that was her giving me the inner strength to just know that I could go on, and like my hair would grow back. No insult to my father's memory, no insult to the significance that he played in my life, but Mom was right. I remember Dad. I remember the importance that he held in my life, but I also remember that our life continues, and we have to remain strong and focus on what's constant in life.
Tom?
Well, I'm a secular humanist, so I'm neither religious nor spiritual. I guess for me it would be 1995 when my mother died. She'd had a long illness, and she died by her own hand, and it was not planned. It happened rather suddenly. And I remember being very curious myself. I had originally been Catholic, and this was really the first big trauma in my life after by then about 12 or 15 years that I had been non-religious, and I was very curious myself how I would deal with this. And what I discovered was twofold. One, I simply did deal with it. I didn't feel the need to pray, didn't feel the need to look for any sort of spiritual guidance. I also found myself taking a certain degree of comfort in the fact that I didn't have to worry about questions like, how can this be happening? How could my mother have suffered so much if God is in charge of the universe? And, there's an all-good being who's in charge of everything, and it's all his work of authorship. How can this pain happen? And the fact that I don't have a religious perspective freed me from that. And I think looking back on that, of course, there's the personal grief, these things you just deal with. And whether you do it in your own heart or whether you do it by praying, I think the actual process that's gone through is probably the same for most people. But the thing that struck me most about it in retrospect was the fact that being non-religious, I looked at it with a different set of expectations and didn't encounter some of the dilemmas that I probably would have when I believed.
Dean Baxter, good to see you again.
Well, it's good to be back. I think for me, similarly as some others have mentioned, is the passing of a parent. And for me, it was my father in '95. And being a person who is religious as well as emotional, it was very painful for me. I watched him die of cancer, and I was very, not only feeling alone, facing for the first time the reality of life's mortal character, but very angry with God. And to me, anger is often love frustrated, and my love was very much frustrated. And it came out of, the strength that I found came out of telling God how angry I was, and feeling free and being supported by others to pray angry prayers, and to be able to feel free to talk with others about that anger. And that was a big growth for me, because it wasn't easy to do that, but it was a part of the healing process for me, so that it was not only the matter of losing someone that I loved, but it was also that God who had sustained me in so many other areas of my life and so many other times. And this was perhaps the moment that I could not deny how angry I was with God. So angry prayer was a real gift for me.
Angry prayer. Dr. Fields, finish it off before we go to the break.
Well, yes, there are three signal events in my life. I'll tell them very briefly. One was as a little child, when on Saturdays my father would take us to my grandmother's house, and my grandmother would take out letters she'd received from her brothers in Czechoslovakia, and they were begging for visas. They were begging to get out. They were detailing the laws, the anti-Jewish laws that had just come in. And she would beg my father to please, Billy, get them a visa. And my father, it's the only time I ever saw him cry, would cry. And he would say, Ma, they're not giving visas to Czech Jews. Well, as my grandmother then would take out the photographs, and she would point to me, and she would say, you have to. You see, Rona looks just like so-and-so. And Arthur, my brother, just like so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. These are your children. You have to. And my father would cry again. And I got a little bit older, and I saw the pictures of the concentration camps and the bodies. And I looked for my own face. And I wondered how this could happen in the world. That was the beginning. When I was 15, because I'd had rheumatic fever and polio, I had to go to a school for crippled children. And I was shocked. I was horrified. This was back in the days when crippled children were set aside. And I discovered that most of the children were from poor families, from the poor side of Chicago. And it was pretty horrible. They were little tiny kids, and they were on crutches, and they were in wheelchairs, and they couldn't even move their heads. And I was shocked. I was horrified. And I said, how can there be a God when all of these things happen? That's the eternal question. So my father and mother had me talk to the rabbi, who was a very sophisticated but very kind person. And he said, I want you to read the book of Job. And I did, and I came back, and I said, well, it's just like I said. There's no God. This is ridiculous. And he said, read it again. Well, I went through it 3 times, and finally, I think I understood. Only the beginning. Only the beginning of the message. All right, the 3rd time was in Lebanon in 1982. And I was in Sabra and Shatila with my students from AUB, and we were interviewing the survivors of the massacre. And there was a woman who had lost 11 members of her family. And she was sitting there with the 2 surviving children and telling us what had happened. And she told it very dryly. She was still in shock, really, and the children too. But when she finished, she said, well, is there anything more you'd like to know? And my students and I were crying. And I said, how can you get yourself up in the morning? And she looked up and put her hands out like this, and she said, Allah. And at first I thought, I mean, how can she say that, what she's saying? And then I realized that this was the same expression of faith in a very troubled time, for very troubled people, for people who'd suffered a great deal, that I had heard the other 2 times. And it sort of came together for me. These were different situations. These were different faiths. These were different circumstances, but all of them had to do with violence. All of them had to do with cruelty. All of them had to do with the most extraordinary kind of assault on the psyche that anyone can endure. And how do you endure it? What is the mechanism? Where do you go with it? Those are my 3 experiences.
We are going to take a little break. You have had a chance to meet all of the people on the panel telling very personal experiences. Sit tight. This is America. Let me go around the table, introduce everyone, thank everyone for being here on a more formal basis. Carol Rayburn, PhD, Dr. Rayburn, clinical consulting research psychologist. She's served as president of the Maryland Psychological Association, copyrighted 13 psychological inventories, and has taught at a number of colleges and universities, including Johns Hopkins University. Good friend Father William Byron is with us, SJ. Those initials stand for the Society of Jesus. He is pastor of Holy Trinity Roman Catholic Church in Washington, D.C., has served as rector of the Georgetown Jesuit community at Georgetown, president of Catholic University of America, my alma mater, and also the University of Scranton. I did not go to the University of Scranton. He is the author of more than a half a dozen books. One of them comes into play here today, Answers from Within, Spiritual Guidelines for Managing Setbacks in Work and Life. Good to see you, Father. Dr. James Zogby is with us, founder and president of the very, very important Arab American Institute here in Washington. He writes a weekly Washington Watch column, which is published in 14 Arab countries, and hosts a television series seen internationally. Good to have you with us again. Tom Flynn with us, editor of Free Inquiry. That's a publication of the Council for Secular Humanists. He's the media coordinator for the Center for Inquiry International and founding coordinator of the First Amendment Task Force. Very Reverend Nathan Baxter is with us. He is Dean of the Washington National Cathedral, one of the most beautiful churches any place. He's the chief priest and executive officer of the world's 6th largest cathedral, which receives approximately 1 million visitors and worshipers each year, and he is the author of a wonderful little book. He sent me a copy after he had appeared on a program some months ago, Visions for the Millennium, Thoughts on Christian Living. What a beautiful book. Thank you. Rona Fields is with us. Dr. Fields, clinical and consulting psychologist with associates in community psychology. She has had extensive research and residence experience in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and is the author of the book on the screen right now, The Future of Women. If you would like to get in touch with us or any of our guests, please drop us a line. We are at thisisamerica.net, and you can always reach us in the office, 202-371-5460. That number should be along with fire and police, I think, for numbers most frequently called. You can call the office and just say hello to the staff if you want. It's that easy. Talk a little bit about this business of faith, and let's mix it up here a little bit and give everybody a chance to talk faith or without faith. You can't define it, or can you define it? Father Byron, can you define faith?
Well, it's a gift.
Short
and that's
gift, okay.
The image that I like to use is a bed of embers. It's there, it's given, and then there are times when you fan those embers. It could be liturgy, it could be prayer, it could be walking along a shore, it could be looking into a fireplace. And then as that consciousness of God's love for you rises, as the consciousness of your relationship with God rises, you're then into what I call spirituality, which is prayer elevated to a lifestyle, and it really affects your outlook, your attitude, your approach to life.
Do you think that prayer, let's get Dean Baxter in here as well, do you think prayer changes God, or do you think it changes the prayer? Huh? Father Byron seems to suggest that it changes the prayer, and not the prayee up there, although God is not deaf, right?
Yeah, it's all about that. Well, there are times we perhaps feel that way, and I've had those moments myself. I think that the power of prayer, to me, is that it opens me up. I'm a person who stays a lot in the cognitive. And there is a tendency,
that means up here,
the rational, it's somehow I can figure it out. It's worthwhile if I or somebody I know can figure it out. And being able to be forced that there is something within me that is more than what I can rationalize, and that there are things in my life that are not controllable. Prayer opens me up to confess that reality, and then it connects me with God.
And when you ask the prayer, you ask the question that way, you're thinking of the prayer petition. You know, dear God, give me
Oh,
this.
yeah.
Okay, that's like the line you have. You're in a boat, you know, and you throw it out. When you bring the boat in, it catches on a cleat. You don't pull that dock to yourself. You pull yourself to the dock. And when you make the prayer petition, you're asking for the disposition to open yourself up to what God really wants
Let me
you
just
to have.
build on the first question about faith, because one thing I've become increasingly aware of is the distinction between faith and certainty, and the danger that when faith represents itself as certainty and becomes dogmatic, that it becomes the phenomena we witness in the world today. And therefore, to me, the most powerful instances of faith and the periods in our lives when we experience that reality, the greatest are the times when we are the least certain and the most troubled, and we have to make that leap from certainty to where we simply don't know where we're going or what to believe. And therefore, to me, faith includes a really healthy dose of humility. And the problem of dogmatism or of fundamentalism in all of the religious traditions is when faith is absent and is replaced by dogma and certainty, and therefore there's no humility, and I am absolutely right. I just want to make a comment, too, about the point you made, Ron. My PhD is in Islamic studies, but also comparative religions, and the thing that was most intriguing to me is that somebody said to me one time, what did you learn? And I said that we're one species, and that it doesn't matter what cultural expression, what language, what tradition, cultural or religious tradition, that we're all speaking about a very common reality, and that when you peel away the different layers, that behind the symbols we use is one reality, one basic human need.
So you're telling me about the human experience is the same for everyone.
It's interesting that in this very period that we're in right now, we're celebrating three responses to stress and tragedy. There is the crucifixion, resurrection. In the Christian tradition, there's the Passover. There's also Ashura, which is a very powerful and very emotional period for Shia Muslims, in which they very dramatically, maybe more powerfully than anything other than what I know in the Catholic tradition of the Good Friday Mass of the Pre-Sanctified, this agonizing ritual of
wonder also, though,
suffering and death.
Given the post-9/11 period, I think one of the things that's most powerful about where we are now is that for most Americans, I think we've all had personal struggles and tragedies, and I think it's good to tell our story, so that's a part of the being mindful that we're all human. But I think this is, for our generation, the first time we have shared a common sense of grief, a common sense of vulnerability that won't go away. And I think what that has done is that has forced us in two ways. As I travel around and talk with people, it has forced us on the one hand to begin to reach out and to discover not just who we are one of another, but what are the kinds of things that give you spiritual strength. I mean, the largest selling books are on Islam, and then others are on other religions. Americans wanting to know what makes people tick. And I think it speaks well of America that what we are trying to do is to find out. We're not making the assumptions that one group of radicals represent an entire faith group. But the other is that I think it has pushed us deeper into our own experience, to fan the flames, as you've spoken about, to begin to ask questions about how does my faith, and I speak of both religious faith, but also the faith in genius. If one has faith in oneself or the resilience of humanity, it still forces us down to trust that there is something more about us than the kinds of things we normally think of as the intellect.
Yeah, that's where I think spirituality comes in, because I've been doing a lot of my research on the differences between spirituality and religiousness, and I don't think they're the same. I think a person can be an atheist, I don't know about a humanist atheist or what, but can own the spirituality, because this means caring for other people. It may also involve recognition of a higher power. But I think that with all the tragedy going on, if there is not what some have called the milk of human kindness in spirituality, then there's going to be a very hard time for those individuals that don't have that. I've also been interested in developing with a colleague, Lee Richmond, theobiology, looking at how the sciences can add to our information on religiousness and spirituality, not leaving them as two fighting strains of knowledge. So I would think that when we look at people who are troubled, and of course, as Rona and I know as psychologists and all the rest of us know, humans are so complex. We're looking at so many facets. We're not sure which thing comes into play at what time, but we just hope that somehow there is that touch of humanness that each of us can connect with the other in the time of trouble.
Tom, how does that all resonate with what people are saying here?
Well, I'm hearing two things. I'm hearing some broad agreement that the essential function of prayer is soliloquy, is the effect on the prayer, and I would certainly agree with that. I mean, from my standpoint, prayer is sort of like picking up the phone and there's no one on the other side. But if that helps you get your priorities in order, very well, that can be helpful. I think it can be more helpful if the process that's going on is recognized more objectively for what it is. We also veered into this whole topic of spirituality, and I find that endlessly fascinating, partly because it's so difficult to nail down what you mean by that. It sounded for a moment there as though you were defining spirituality as being what I might call empathy or fellow feeling, and these are wonderful qualities, but they're emotional responses tempered by cognition. What is this spirit that comes in? I mean, I presume we're not talking about ectoplasm. What does the word mean? And I'm not singling you out. It seems to mean different things with every speaker.
I think the exciting part of that conversation is whether, as we seek to be a community, we're more concerned about how we can define ourselves as different from the other, or whether we're more concerned about acknowledging that, as you just put it just then, for you, maybe there's no one as you would want to put it on the other end of the phone. I wouldn't agree with that, but I would say that given the kinds of crises, if that's helping you get through, all right. But on the other hand, the resilience that I see in human beings comes from somewhere. That it is something more than our ability to say, well, I am human, I am complex, and so something down there in the formula is about my being human that can enable me to move forward. What it says to me is that there is a gift that God has given us, and that in those times of great spiritual need, whether we acknowledge the author or not, that gift can be drawn forth.
There's actually, if I can be scientific without being antagonistic at this point, there are actually several different kinds of mental processes, if you want to call them that, or thinking, of which human beings are capable. We call one of them cognition and the other conation, which is the knowing without the facts. It's kind of like the thing that Mark Twain called faith is believing what you know ain't so. But that's conation. And that's the part of the mind that is operating when we don't have the immediate facts ordered and organized into a plan that we can latch onto rationally. So this capacity for conation, which is an incredibly uniquely, I think, human capacity, and I've studied apes too, and I really think there are a lot of things that apes can do that we don't credit, but conation is not one of them. And that's the kind of capacity for latching on to something that is not defined in the universe we call reality. And that's what we're using when we use faith, I think,
let me ask
scientifically.
Tom of this. When the events of September 11th happened, or going back to the death of your own parent, does that not slam you up against the wall of life, as I call it, and cause you to ask yourself the big questions? Who am I? What am I doing here? Where am I going? Is there a God? Is there an afterlife? do those things occur in your own thought process when those mega events happen?
I think to some degree that happens to everyone. I came to this point having gone through a lot of that process earlier in my life. I was born Catholic and started asking a lot of tough questions, and mostly alone, and over a period of several years eventually ceased to be Catholic and ceased to be Christian, and ultimately
was there an
ceased to
incident
believe
that
in God.
happened, or was it a thought process that led you to walk away?
It was a thought process. The first thing, we're going back into my early adolescence here, was just confusion over the existence of so many other faiths in the world. And I'd had a fairly conservative, pre-Vatican II Catholic kind of upbringing, and one true faith and all this sort of thing. So the fact that there were Episcopalians out there building huge cathedrals was something that filled me with cognitive dissonance, although I wouldn't have used that word then. And the process of inquiry continued, and eventually I got to where I am today and where I've been for about 15 years as an atheist and a secular humanist. So to some degree, I've done some of that soul searching. But of course, there's the emotional impact of losing a parent or something like September 11th. And sure, it throws you against the cliff. I kind of use and draw some of my imagery from Nietzsche here. It's like being on the abyss and being forced to look down. Now, to me, I sometimes think that faith can be an illicit way of jumping to the other side, of resolve.
That. And then get slammed up against the wall, as you described. I had a teacher in graduate school, Maurice Friedman. Never forgot him. He taught us Job. And I remember he said, Job comes down to two fundamental questions. What don't I have when I have everything? And what do I have when I have nothing? And there are times when, at a death or at a crisis of some sort, when despite the fact that you've had all the problems worked out and all the pieces in place and it all makes perfect sense, when all of a sudden you look at it and it just isn't there. And sometimes your only response is that woman in the camp, Allah. There's something that is bigger than me, larger than me, that holds it together and makes me make sense. And I must confess that it's not with me all the time. But it's with me enough that it makes sense for me and my life and helps me and protects me from the arrogance of certitude. I'm never that certain.
One of the most important things that faith has done for me is to help me remember that I'm still becoming. I always get nervous, whether it's religious or philosophical or whatever, when I come to a place when I'm set on the answers.
I'm not there yet.
And one of the things you mentioned prayer earlier, that there are parts of me that really would like to say, okay, I'm going to get it right, I'm going to have the answers, and I'm going to decide who God is, what God is, and so on. And yet what prayer does is that it keeps me, first of all, in conversation with God. Sometimes it's just simply listening and being aware. But also, it keeps me open, humble. Somebody mentioned humility, that I get surprises sometimes from my Islamic brothers or my Jewish brothers or my philosophical buddies or whatever about the wonder and the power of life. And for me, then, faith is that one constant in the pilgrimage of becoming.
Father Byron's trying to get in here.
Well, let me take another cut at this. First of all, I think faith is the act by which you entrust yourself to God. And it is trust. And doubt does not disqualify you from the community of believers. But if you push me to the wall, as you sometimes would want to push somebody to the wall, and you said, now you got to boil it all down to one word, what's religion all about? I would say gratitude. I think you get to gratitude. And you might say, well, how about love? And I'd say, all right, but if you look at letter of John, he says, it's not that you first loved God, but God loved you. And that's a foundation for grace and gratitude are not unrelated. But you tie this into 911, and what I have seen in the wake of 911 is purposeful gratitude. I've seen people realign their values, reassess where they are, and not in any triumphalistic, oh boy, I was saved, but in a basic sense of gratitude, they say, now, I'm going to move forward with my life I want that life to be purposeful, and I want that life to be an expression of the gratitude that I feel, and that gratitude is at the heart of my religion.
Let me go in a slightly different direction and apply it. I'll put a couple of things out on the table. Life, as we all experience, is good, bad, and so-so, right? You know, it's going to be
more so-so.
ups and downs and sideways, as I say it is. Rabbi Harold Kushner a few years ago wrote the magnificent book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And, but life is life, huh?
See,
life is life.
That book you mentioned of mine, the editor at Macmillan, when he asked me to write that book, he said, did you ever read that book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People? I said, no. He said, read it. He said, we want one when bad things happen to good people in the workplace, or when bad things happen to good people off the job, like death, divorce, illness, and they have to go back to work. And I said, well, you're looking for a workplace spirituality. He said, right. Then I was working on this thing, and I ran into Rabbi Kushner. And I said, I read your book, and I said, we Christians, and it's appropriate at this time of year to mention it, we have an additional dimension on that. He said, I know you do. And I said, well, we go through death to life. That's resurrection theology. We go through defeat to victory, and we don't want to be triumphant and arrogant about it, but we want to be grateful.
Grateful, back to gratitude.
But there are two strong emotions, I think that's been mentioned here, fear and anger. And they both can be the starting point, hopefully not the end point, of where one goes with faith and with spirituality. But we're all we get to a point where we're desperate, and we say, hey, I've exhausted everything that's human, and now where do I go from here? And I think it's at that point that we reach out to a higher power, whatever we may call that higher power, God, nature, whatever. But sometimes we are tried to the very end of what we have, and we do become humble. And we know that humanness goes a certain way, and then something else takes over for many of us.
Let me ask Jim this question, and then Dr. Fields, maybe you could comment as well. The poor folks on either side of the strife in Palestine and Israel, where do they go to get the courage to get up every day? I mean, where do they reach deep within themselves, living in that fear that Carol just talked about? I mean, it's just what a way to live.
Yeah, and I think that not unlike the 9/11 experience we talk about here, that we have to understand that different people do it in different ways.
Yeah, okay.
There is, I remember that right after September 11th, we experienced hate crimes as Arab Americans and Muslims.
I remember. We talked about that.
But the more overwhelming experience were the acts of kindness, of people wanting to reach out of the stress, out of the pain that they experienced on September 11th. They wanted to show a different expression to us. And to say, that's not us, and you are part of us, etc. Same thing happens with Palestinians and Israelis. There are Israelis who are mad as hell and angry and want to kill Arabs and their dogs. And there are Palestinians who wake up angry and want to kill Israelis and are furious. But there also are Palestinians and Israelis who wake up every day and say, how do I make a better life here? How do I get them to understand me and what's happening to me? And then there are people in between who wander between anger and reaching out. And I think that there are so many interesting expressions of that, these common efforts of Jews and Arabs to come together and say, let's find a different way. There are Palestinians reaching out and Israelis. So I don't think that there's one Israeli response. There's not one Palestinian response. Good. And I think that the role of leadership, and where it's sometimes so absent in our own country, is that we don't help the people whose response is, let's change the circumstances. We don't help them to come forward. Instead, we almost play into the hardness of both, and that's the frustrating part.
Dr. Fields?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I keep very aware of the efforts toward peace and reconciliation on the ground in Israel-Palestine. And there is a strong and healthy and growing movement. Witness the 300 reserve officers who have refused to serve on the West Bank. Witness coming together under the most awful circumstances, the Israeli and Palestinian parents who came here with the coffin to show what they've lost, but what they found together. The human mind is a search for meaning, and this was wonderfully described by Viktor Frankl. And the search for meaning is, in large part, the cognitive as contrasted with the cognitive, the rational. When they find the meaning in the connection, it's possible to go forward against adversity. With something else that my father passed on to me that was very useful and held to it for a long time today. And that is, your job as a person is to turn adversity into adventure. And in a way, a very real, important way. That's what those people have done. They're plowing new ground. They're discovering new territory in the possibilities of living together. You have to contrast that with some of the other effects, some of the disastrous effects of this prolonged violence and intergenerational conflict, which we see in so many places, because the ultimate effect is that leaders get elected who are the most polarized and represent the most polarizing aspects of the polity, that people become factionated, that it's not just one group against another group, it's within families. And we see that in Afghanistan. We see that in so many ways, in so many places. So the violence and the troubles can affect human beings in many ways, as we've talked about. But the thing I think we want to focus on at this time of year particularly is the meaning of which humans are capable in the worst of adversity.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I did a book one time, kind of similar in a little way with Father Byron's book, with the most horrible title I ever came up with, because it's a phrase that everybody hears all the time, but it's hard to remember if you're going to go into a bookstore. The title of the book was "When the Worst That Can Happen Already Has." And one of the things that was picking up on your point, Dr. Fields, was people who had gone through these horrible situations came out the other side, and they were different people, and they were stronger people, they were better people, they had more dimensions to their life. And the one that just came into my mind right now, well, a good example would be King Jordan, who's the president of Gallaudet University, who lost his hearing in a motorcycle accident. And people like that would tell you that their lives were, this was my life when I was on that level and I had the accident, and this is what happened to me because of the accident. One guy told me that all he did was ride his motorcycle. It wasn't King, but ride his motorcycle and shoot pool. But after the accident, and he was paralyzed from the neck down, he got into classical music, and he got into poetry, and he got this and that. And I mean, that's not the way you'd want to live, but it just opened him up as a human being. So when these, maybe talk a little bit about that when you are going through, and I say this, when you're in the middle of great tragedy, the mind as a human mind can only focus on what have I lost. Can't see the potential of the good that's going to happen down the road.
Here's another aspect of this that has come to me, and that is the concept of grace. If faith is unexplainable, grace is as well, and
that's even worse.
And I can only use the word to account for why is it that some people will emerge from disaster that's been imposed upon them bitter, and some people will emerge from that disaster with, that should never happen to anyone again, how can I make it better? And some people will have the ability to reach out beyond themselves and be giving to others, and some will only withdraw and focus only on that pain. And I can only use the word grace. I mean, it's gratuitous, it's unexplainable, it is something that requires a different kind of intervention to explain.
Let me have Dean Baxter, because he writes about grace in his book.
Yes, I think that one of the things that, I like to interface grace with idolatry. there's a way of thinking, and I think all of us do, but I certainly know that I do. There are ways in which I think this is what it means to be human. I feel human today because I can ride my motorcycle, or I can express and explain what's happened to me here or there, or I'm sitting within the comfort zone of an altar and, in sacrament and so on. And then there come those times in my life when those things crumble. They fall away. I'm a Vietnam veteran. There was no altar. There was no bread and sacrament. I was a combat medic. And it forced me to realize that there was more to the resources of life and more in terms of meaning than the things that I used to protect me from a broader understanding. And I think that's another way of looking at it, is that there are many times that tragedy, which I don't think God wills or any of us would choose. And yet out of that, when we accept the fact that, okay, I can't do the things that I normally would do or rely upon, is there more to me? Is there more to life? And I think that that's when we begin to discover the grace of life that helps us not to be obsessed by what we have lost, including the things that we by which we define ourselves.
Do we sense nothingness when we are in the midst of an adversity, and then maybe we feel suicidal, that there is no lifeboat for us? But if whatever, God for me, something else for someone else, is that life-saving toss to rescue us from the abyss, that's what's so all-important.
Of all of the children I've examined all over the world who are living and growing up in situations of ongoing violence and intercommunal strife, most of them, unfortunately, have been truncated in their moral development, and most of them have been truncated in their ability to imagine themselves in another place, in another way. But in all of these populations, even amongst the Khmer Rouge, with whom I stayed for a while, there was always at least one child who could imagine beyond what was the ugliness, the horror, the vendetta, the retribution, and think of himself doing something else. There's always that one child. And that makes me think that the reason humanity has survived through all of its horrors, through all of its inhumanities, is because in every generation there are those who can get past it, who can imagine a better way, a meaning, and who can carry humanity forward.
Let me ask Father Byron a question here, since we're talking about some of these, and I'm not going to make you the spokesperson for the Catholic Church by any stretch of the imagination, but the Catholic Church is going through a rough period of time right now.
Very rough.
Yet you read so many articles where it says that so many of the people who are Catholics are questioning the institution of the Church or some of the leadership of the Church. But they always seem to say in the same article that people's faith is not being diminished. How can you talk a little bit and explain that?
It's remarkable, and I've experienced it up close and firsthand. We are in a crisis. There's no other way to describe it, and a crisis means a turning point. And there's outrage, there's shame, there's deep hurt. There's an effort on the part of those who are not victims to really empathize and find out what it means to be a victim. And those who are victimized kind of dismiss the possibility that anybody else is really interested or can understand that. So you're immobile in that phase. The people are angry, and there's a question of trust, the word I use to say what faith is. There has been a violation of trust on the part of clergy who have done inappropriate things, in some cases criminal things. The Church lives on the trust that it has in individual members, and when they violate that trust, it's damage, it's serious damage to the Church. The Church is the people, however. It's not just those who are the ministers, and certainly not just those who are members of the hierarchy. The trust of the hierarchy has taken a big hit on the part of the people. But the people almost uniformly, and I'm talking about an auditorium full of them that I was with for an hour and a half last week, great faith in the sacramental life of the Church, the sense of Easter, they're not saying, I'm out of here. There are a few who are, but very, very, very few. They know that we're in this thing together. Some are guilty, all are responsible. And in the response we make, all of us participate, and one of the responses that some of us have to make is prayer and fasting. There is sin, there's sickness, and there's crime. And there are remedies for each of those. And for sin, it's repentance. For sickness, it's some kind of cure. For crime, it's punishment. And the people are going to be stronger at the end of this than they are right now.
I was going to ask you, do you subscribe to Dr. Field's idea that some good is going to come out of it?
Yeah, Paul to the Romans, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And something good will come out. Very, very hard, tough price to pay. But we're people of hope, and that's that resurrection spirit that characterizes the Easter season.
I think that's a tenet of faith, that belief in the good conquering the evil.
And also, I think if you're right for this season. I mean, that's the powerful emphasis. I think also that people who live in community, and especially faith community, understand that a part of being in community is to be vulnerable. And so the whole issue of trust, dependency, not only on God but on one another, means that there are going to be times when we are going to be hurt. We're going to be disappointed. We're going to be let down. And so it is in those times that people struggle. It's not easy. It's not the fait accompli. But at the same time, there is an understanding that there is something deeper and more powerful here than individuals and incidents and situations. And so it is in those times that people dig down into their greater sense of spirituality, while at the same time confronting with a strong sense of justice where the violation has come. And many times people are amazed that communities hold together in times of great crises. In the African American community, you go all the way back to the stories of slavery. And it was something about not just the violation of masters, but slaves who violated other slaves in terms of betraying. But there was this understanding, if we're going to be community, we have to accept we're going to be vulnerable. And faith was an important undergirding.
I just wanted to say that, going along with what you just mentioned, when I was in Russia one time, I was talking with someone from my faith denomination, and they were going through such a terrible time in Russia. And I said, I will pray very hard for you when I get back to my country. And he looked at me and he said, I will pray very hard for you and all the people that are in the United States, because where there is such wealth, where there's such resource, that's where people go away from God. And you need our prayers more than even we need yours.
I remember saying to my, something was going on in my life. I said to my mother one time, I said, flippantly, as young people do, I said, pray to the God of your choice. And she turned around to me and she said, it's all the same God. She just was just flippant right back to me. She said, it's all the same God, Do you subscribe to, is there, whether it's Allah or Jesus or whatever, it's where the Father, the supreme being, does everyone subscribe to that?
I certainly do.
Well,
I certainly do.
I would not. I don't believe in one more God than everybody else around the table.
Is it tough to be? Let me just ask this, Jim. Is it tough to be a secular humanist in a kind of a religious country or a religious world, or is it kind of live and let live?
I think it's become more difficult since September 11th. Because so much of the public expression of pain and loss has taken on religious overtones, often in settings that ordinarily would have been quite secular. Where there's a memorial service in, say, the National Cathedral, of course you expect religious dialogue. When there's a memorial service in Shea Stadium, it seems a little out of place. And, signs saying, God bless America, and every door, and well, lots of Americans use a different word for God. Maybe they call him Jehovah or Allah or whatever it might be. And interestingly, over this last 10 years, during which the temperature of public piety to American life has risen quite a bit, the number of people who identify themselves as non-religious has gone way up. In 1990, City University of New York did a major religious identification study and identified the none of the above population at about 8%. We've seen that number consistently climb in various polls. CUNY's new Religious Identification Survey 2001 pegged the non-religious at 14%. Now, there's some methodological things in there. They changed a couple of the questions. But that community is rising.
Let me just get an observation in about Islam, which has taken a real hit. And in part, the President has done a good job in trying to focus people on it. But despite some of those expressions, the emails that we get and the expressions that we hear of people who want to deny the validity of Islam, of that faith, and of people who believe in Islam, has really become rather horrible. And I think that it is very painful to Muslims that their faith tradition is not understood as an Abrahamic faith, and that the legitimacy of their faith expression is not respected, and that they take the kind of, that they're taking the kind of verbal abuse. I did a TV show last night, and the second segment was Billy Graham apologizing for anti-Semitic statements he made 30 years ago, and yet Pat Robertson and others have made horrible statements about Islam today, and no one's asking them to apologize, and no one is holding them accountable for it. We really need a different discourse.
Some have, and I have.
We need a different discourse about religion.
I have challenged them, not only in sermons, but also through the internet, where the word has gone out. But I think what you raise is an important factor, that 9/11 has shed light on many things, but we've been struggling for some time for the identity of America.
Dennis Holey is the author of The Miracle of Change, available at local bookstores.
Underwriting for This Is America is made possible by the American Legacy Foundation. Tobacco-related illnesses kill about 165,000 women each year. You should know. AmericanLegacy.org. The National Education Association